Good evening once again, my friends, and welcome to the Leo and Larry Show, the show that helps you to know the things you need to know and tells you the places where you need to go. And of course, my co host, Larry Smith, can't be with us. He's with the Lord now, but of course, his presence, his spirit still is here with us. And we want to encourage all of you to continue to read and especially subscribe to the Community Times if you're in the PD area, the Upstate Times if you're in the Greenville area, and the Charleston Chronicle if you're in the lowlands. And as always, we have really great and awesome guests, and we have another awesome guest for you. And he is a retired professor of sociology and political science from Coker College. He is an author. He has run as a candidate for Congress and is running right now again for Congress in our area. And so we want to welcome at this time none other than Dr. Mal Hyman.
Great to join you.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you so much for coming on. And, we were really Pacific because we had some folks who said, wow, we have the primaries coming up soon. But we also had Dr. King, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday coming up. Officially, it starts tomorrow. And so we know that you have done a lot of studies. You've looked at a lot of studies, you've done a bunch of reading, you've done a lot of writings about the contribution, the impact on society and the world that Dr. King was able to give each and every one of us. And we live and prosper and have joy and happiness because of some of the work he did. So why don't you tell us something about yourself, and then let's have a conversation about Dr. King and his work and his life.
I grew up in Los Angeles, started UCLA in 1968, and the political turmoil was so great, I kind of moved from sports and romance to being captured and confused by politics. The political assassinations of that year, with King being assassinated, Robert Kennedy being assassinated, the huge demonstrations against the war in Vietnam, the race riots, the impending war on poverty, and the March on Washington. I could see the air I was breathing in Los Angeles. It got my attention, and I studied politics as an undergraduate. As I finished, I worked in the George McGovern campaign, and then spent a summer in the Middle East trying to develop a democratic Israel. And on a walk through Jerusalem, decided I'd try to be a teacher. I taught in the public schools, in the state prisons, taught in the prisons from 77 to 82. My ticket to grad school was teaching in a maximum security prison. I think that allows me to see politics more clearly. When I went to grad school, I met someone who was part of the Pentagon Papers. You may remember that was the big WikiLeaks of the era on the Vietnam War.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the
Daniel Ellsberg.
I met with a guy who worked with Ellsberg. His name was Mel Gertov. And 3 cups of coffee later, he had me convinced I needed to go to grad school. I really have respect for people who speak truth to power and are willing to lose their job and get arrested. So that got me toward grad school. I never really figured that was going to happen. And friends in grad school said, you're going to teach political science, you have to go to the war zones. So I went to Nicaragua in 1985 with a church group called Witness for Peace. Became hooked on going with those delegations because, frankly, my Spanish was never that good. I needed a translator. And they would take us around and we'd talk to elected officials and church leaders, community leaders, and they'd all tell their story. They'd be translated. They'd pop you on a bus and you go to a hole in the wall restaurant. And after seeing that, I got a little bit more bold and figured that I should be doing human rights work and monitoring elections. So I did human rights work during the first Intifada in the West Bank and Gaza in '88, monitored election in Nicaragua, 1990, Mexico, 1994. Got fortunate, hired on at Coker College back in '87, and the dean was encouraging me to take on these tasks and just to talk about it. So it's a good place to teach. I've been involved in the community. We met, I guess, about 30 years ago.
Yeah.
When you came to town, and we were on the same wavelength. And you've been a good influence on me, and just glad we're friends.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you. So that that is you have been able to get a lot of different perspectives, which I find that extremely admirable and necessary. Especially, I'm really glad that you're running for Congress, because we need elected officials who have different perspectives. So you really know what poverty is like, firsthand talking with people. You know what it is for people to struggle for their rights. You know what it's like what the impacts of war, what war has on people and countries. And then your work in communities here and your knowledge and experience about politics are all, I just have to say this, they make you extremely qualified to serve for the people of this area. I can't think of any other candidate for office on the federal level who would have to deal with all of these issues that has the extensive background that you have. And I'm just saying that for our audience, so they acknowledge, we don't send many people to DC who understand things from different levels and different perspectives. So I want to thank you for your service, okay? And talking about service, we're entering the day when we celebrate Dr. King's birthday, and people say it's not a day off, it's a day on, where we should do something for community service. Let's talk about Dr. King and his beginnings in Montgomery, Alabama, because that's when the world first meets him with the Montgomery boycott. And let's talk about some of the other things that he has done, not just from the I Have a Dream speech or his mountaintop speech, which unfortunately is all that we hear. And most people don't know that those are the ends. That is the ending for both of those speeches. They don't hear the entire speech and therefore don't really understand from his writings, his books, etc., why Dr. King did what he was doing and why it's important that we continue today. So why don't we start off with Montgomery and the Montgomery bus boycott?
I think you're right with what you say. Martin Luther King gets frozen in the I Have a Dream speech. If we turn the clock back to the beginnings of his teachings, you can see the impact of Benjamin Mays when he's a student at Morehouse. You can see the influence of his dad, granddad, who were preachers, his ability to read widely with his PhD, to understand Gandhi's civil rights movement, Satyagraha in India, to apply it in the United States. And he was the new guy coming into Montgomery.
He'd only been there a year.
Right.
He was 26 years old.
Right. Mm-hmm. And the town fathers and the leaders in the Black community turned to him because he was quite promising and he got along with everyone. He seemed like somebody that people could work with, because others had been fighting for years about different methods and ideas. And he rose to the occasion very quickly because he was at heart a prophet. And it's a rare blessing to have lived in the time of a prophet. And some of his speeches and sermons then are not only pragmatic in terms of progressive politics, building coalitions, timely, but also to be able to rouse people to fight when it looks hopeless. And there's one speech he gives where it's early on in the Montgomery campaign, and he's saying, if we're wrong, the Constitution is wrong.
Yes.
If we're wrong, the Bill of Rights is wrong.
Mhm.
If we're wrong, God Almighty is wrong.
Mhm.
And the people go crazy. And they know this guy is serious and he is there to lead them. And all of them were risking arrest and losing their jobs, maybe beatings. So he was as hot as the moment needed. He was prophetic. And then, of course, once he's able to prevail in that fight, then people recognize that we have a unique leader, someone like we hadn't seen in generations. And he was able to put together the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Some who might not have had a chance, and I have great blessing to have been able to read for my livelihood. And in reading through Gandhi, I've learned different things. King absorbed them, used them. One of the notions of satyagraha, which King borrowed, was to speak truth to power with love. At first, they avoid you. They try to ignore you. And then they mock you. And then they have to fight you.
And then they have to fight.
And then you win.
And then you win when they fight. And I want, because one thing I want folks to realize too is that because oftentimes what happens, and they call it the Black Messiah thing, that, we have to wait for a great leader to emerge, and then we'll be able to start the fight against racism, exploitation, oppression, injustice, all of these things. But I wanted to just note that with the Montgomery boycott, that was actually started by Rosa Parks and some women. And when they started, they actually, the boycott became out, it started, I believe, December 5th was the first day. And they were actually boycotting for better treatment on the bus. And then they decided that we need a leader. We need, it was a time when they didn't look, it was hard to look on women as leaders. They said, we need a leader. We need someone who can speak well. They turned to Dr. King. I just want to lift that up, Mal, because I want people to realize, as we talk about more and more things that Dr. King was involved in, that he didn't always start stuff. But they knew, like you said, the power of his oratorical skills and his belief and his faithfulness was such that people would say, we need him. We need him to speak that truth to power. And thank you so much for bringing that up. How they mock you and they ignore you, they mock you, and then they fight you. But when they fight you, that's when you win, right?
Thanks. You make a great point that while we tend to look Martin Luther King Day and the civil rights movement at the leaders, there were a range of groups that were involved.
Right.
And women were at least half the movement. That doesn't get highlighted very much in most of the histories. And Eyes on the Prize as a book and as a series is still solid. Taylor Branch's work on King is solid. And all that becomes clear. You got Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, CORE, NAACP in Montgomery. And later the Black Panthers and the Nation of Islam, a range of groups were involved. Southern Christian Leadership Conference and King were kind of the center of the movement.
Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, very important.
Absolutely, very brave. Students need to hear the story of student activism, critical in major movements in the United States, where most of the change comes from the bottom up, not from the top down. King knew it. When the people lead, the leaders tend to follow. And it was, as King wrote, and where do we go from here? The art of reform, it's the art of coalition. And he pulled people together. You know, I just recently went through the Equal Justice Initiative Museum in Montgomery, and wow, that ought to be required for students to go through that. That's right up there with the museums in Washington. In fact, I found it even more powerful, and it slowly works through the movement and highlights women, just as you did in your comment.
Oh yes, absolutely. Diane Nash is one of my sheroes from that time. The voter registration work she did with James Bevel and with Bob Moses was, wow, they went throughout the South just teaching people. But then, you know, the other thing too, as King moves towards his next mountaintop experience, his success is Birmingham. But before then, he goes to Albany, and it just nothing happens. He gets no win. And then Fred Shuttleworth, who's also an awesome leader in Birmingham, or what they call Birmingham then, because they bombed so many homes and churches before the 4 little girls were even killed. Fred Shuttlesworth, Birmingham's airport is named after him. So he wasn't just a flash in the pan for Birmingham. So he invites King to Birmingham, and what happens? It's a struggle, right?
Well, there aren't easy targets, and Laurie Pritchard recognizes the power of nonviolence. So people are quietly and gently arrested. There's less drama. They're unable to mobilize support. There isn't an easy target because segregation is everywhere. And the movement, like they were later in Chicago, and it's a lot of trial and error. People, when they go back and read and analyze it, recognize the value of faith and trial and error and try to figure out what's going to be effective. And Albany was not a big success. And at times they were rolling through the money and they couldn't figure out what to do. And they'd send Coretta Scott King out, do a concert, raise some money, because they were getting arrested, which was one of the standard tactics, and it wasn't working all that well. They learned from it, and it was different as they moved out of Albany into Birmingham.
And I think that's important, because oftentimes in communities, things don't work out, and people feel we failed and we give up. And I brought that up because Dr. King didn't give up after Albany.
Right. The sense of resilience and faith is an inspiration. It's only when you've been through a bunch of fights and lose that you recognize the importance of faith, taking a longer perspective on things. I think he knew he was right, that God was on his side, the people were on his side, and he just had to figure out how to be more effective. And he was willing to do that. You know, by the time he gets the Nobel Peace Prize, he really is speaking globally as to we're all caught in an inescapable web of mutuality. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice anywhere. There's you know, the later prophet speaking more globally of things and bringing in more of a following of liberal whites and people from around the world, which were necessary to strengthen the movement.
So Birmingham, there was a turning point in Birmingham because things weren't going well. Speak to his letter from a Birmingham jail and the Children's Crusade, which is really what turned things around and began to give the movement the kind of momentum it needed to become successful. I think that's important for our young audience, those people who are listening. and tell them how young the children were. So it's not like you have to wait till you become a certain age to get involved with
Children's movement, right? They were 13 to 18. These were kids in junior high and high school that were out there. And in part, they had less to risk because they weren't going to lose their jobs or their mortgages, but they were bold to be able to do it. And that always sends shockwaves through a community when the children lead out of the mouths of babes. Everybody starts to stiffen their spine and fight in a different way. And letter from Birmingham jail, Rev knows better than me, but given a chance to say a few words about it.
Oh, yeah.
Basically talking about those who are supposed to be with us, who are quiet now, have taken the side of the oppressor. You can't stay quiet in time of a crisis, in times of oppression. And King was very clear on that, that he needed the support of the white churches that claimed to be following God.
The white and the black churches.
And the black churches, that's right, that didn't have the courage of their convictions.
Right. And then the children leave school in the thousands, and the jails are full. There's nowhere to put another child. And many of the pictures, the photos that we see from Birmingham at that time, where we see the dogs are being put on human beings and the water hoses and the nightstick, a lot of them are actually the children, aren't they?
That's right. And those pictures went around the world.
Yeah.
And that galvanizes support. As the civil rights movement knew, sometimes you needed drama, as Gandhi knew it, to show the oppressor for what they are, to clarify the conscience of the rest of the country and the world, because they hadn't had their conscience clarified before then.
Yes.
And the pictures and the actions of the oppressor force people to think about that which they're uncomfortable thinking about, or they deny. And it made it front and center, galvanized the civil rights movement when we saw those pictures.
And Gandhi was Dr. King's hero.
Absolutely.
He got his tactics of nonviolence from Gandhi, who was able to use nonviolence to free India from the British after he got deported and put out of South Africa because he was fighting against apartheid. So for some people who don't know the role that Gandhi played, he influenced Dr. King and many other people to use nonviolence as a tactic for progressive and social change. Right?
Absolutely. The movie Gandhi that came out in 1980 and won a bunch of awards still holds up. Marvelous movie. I think people will drift right into it and then see King, as a young student in sociology, read a number of books about Gandhi before he visited India in 1959 and talked with the leaders in India that had worked with Gandhi. So this was a Gandhian method of nonviolent civil disobedience as a strategy and a tactic of love, the sword that heals. And he saw it as the most practical way for oppressed people to be listened to, and it would work today.
Right. And Gandhi, that's why we see artifacts, items from Gandhi in the King Museum in the King Center in Atlanta. He wanted to meet Gandhi, but unfortunately for those young people and others who may not know, he didn't get to meet Gandhi because Gandhi was also assassinated, shot to death, afterwards. So Birmingham, the victory in Birmingham lifts up Dr. King's profile, leads to him getting the Nobel Peace Prize, and also to him speaking at the March on Washington, which King did not plan.
Yeah, you got a great story. You should tell it.
A. Philip Randolph, first of all, who organized the Pullman porters, the blacks who worked on railroads, he came up with the March on Washington at first, And under and under Truman, they actually threatened to march on Washington. I want you to talk about the veterans and others who have marched before, so people don't think that was something that was made up, that we just came up with. We knew that it was a tactic that worked. Even the Klan had used marches, right, in
Sure.
Washington, the Ku
That's
Klux
right.
Klan.
Yep.
So A. Philip Randolph came up with the idea. Baynard Rustin
Right.
actually was the major architect of planning it. Someone else I admire. People know very little about him. There's very few photos of him with Dr. King and others. He worked behind the scenes. And this is again about sacrifice and the other people who sacrificed. He wasn't front and center because he was gay.
That's right.
And
I think
they
there's a
did,
new movie about him.
yeah, there's a new movie out, and they knew that the media and the enemies, if they saw Dr. King with Boehner too often, and they would start a lie, rumors
Right.
that they were lovers. And so I want you to go from there. So King is not even the keynote speaker. A lot of people don't realize that he's the closing speaker, right?
That's right.
Who only has 5 minutes to speak, and you pick it up, and then I'll take it from there.
Well, the I Have a Dream portion of the speech, which he'd given at other rallies and in sermons, actually, it was one of his supporters in the audience, Mahalia Jackson, that called out to him loud enough that he could hear it. Martin, tell him about the dream.
Yes.
And then he launches into it, and of course, it's beautiful and prophetic, and all of us had read and reread it, and it's inspirational. But you're right, he did not figure it on.
The crowd wasn't responding very well when he first started speaking.
That's right.
And Mahalia yells out, "Tell him about the dream, Doctor." And like you said, a lot of people don't know. They thought he just came with that speech. He had made that speech various places. And when she said, "Tell him about the dream," and he launched into it, wasn't written down. He ad-libbed it, right, from where he did it before. And when he started there, that's when the crowd got roused up. And that's like his keynote speech, right?
Brilliant, beautiful. And as we've talked about for years, because I remember we spoke about this when you came over to Hartsville, I guess it was 15 years ago, for our Martin Luther King commemoration, and spoke about what King was saying in 67 and 68 on economic justice and world peace.
Yes,
that doesn't get quoted, like the I Have a Dream speech.
And that was the main part. That was the main message he was trying to put across. That's why later on he did the Poor People's Campaign. Economics and poverty was very, very dear to his heart, right?
He was.
Had to be addressed.
You're right. There were times where he would give talks and sermons where he would say, any religion that professes to save the souls of men and doesn't confront the slums that damn them, the economic conditions that cripple them, is a dry as dust religion.
Right.
And he goes on, he says that the worst form of cruelty is to deny someone health care, and that it's a crime in this wealthy nation for people to work for starvation wages. We don't hear those quotes very often on Martin Luther King Day. I encourage our listeners to listen for that, because that's also a critical part of his message as he moves from civil rights to economic justice by 67 and 68.
And then on to human rights. And the thing is, see, I believe, I can't say, oh, there's a conspiracy, Illuminati, or what, but it is in the interest of some powers to be, not for the public to know what Dr. King was saying, that because people still need decent housing. And he spoke to that, and he was in Chicago organized around that. People, we're still talking about what is a decent wage. We still argue about should minimum wage be $15 an hour. All of those things that you lifted up are crucial issues today. And if we really wanted to continue the work of Dr. King and see his dream realized, we would know all the things he would be saying, and it would be inspiring people to continue his work.
Couldn't agree more. A lot of the later speeches that we've talked about could be quoted at length. King was clear about the war in Vietnam, taking money from the war on poverty. The bombs dropped in Vietnam are exploding in the inner cities. And violence in the inner cities is the language of the oppressed. He was clear on all of that. And we confront big corporations and banks just as the civil rights and economic justice movement of the late 60s did. Now they're bigger and more concentrated and have greater hold over the mass media. So that even on Labor Day, we don't hear about the plight of people working on minimum wage on the mainstream media. So, you know, the old line by Gil Scott-Heron, the revolution won't be televised, you know, we're not going to hear it from them. And that's why podcasts like yours are essential for people to get a sense of the context. King talked about the responsibility of leaders is to understand who has power. And, you know, you've been revealing this, you know, for years on your show. And this is vital for people to understand, to know how we fight against this. And if I might, because I'm carried away talking with you.
Go ahead.
You know,
I get carried away too talking about this. Yeah.
King talked about a revolution of values. This is by 67.
Yes.
To accompany the freedom and scientific revolutions engulfing the earth. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society.
Yeah.
When machines and computers, property rights and profits are more important than people, then racism, materialism, and militarism can't be conquered. It's as true today. That's a critical part of his teaching, but most folks don't know it. I'm lucky.
No, they haven't read his books. You know, where do we go from here? They don't know the concept that he had, the concept of the beloved community that allowed, you know, him to look at Gandhi, to march with Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, the Catholic priests that were there, the whites, the black, what King described as the beloved community. Would just demolish the walls of separation and stuff that we have today that are getting built high and separating us even more. And then he has another quote, which really I think encapsulates all that he did. The three main pillars of Dr. King's work was when he talked about the triple evil, right? The triple threat, which is poverty, militarism, and racism. And when you look at the work that he's done, it fits into all three of those categories, doesn't it? The Poor People's Campaign, work he did in Birmingham, Montgomery, that's the racism piece, and then him coming out against the war in Vietnam. Boy, that was, well, we talk, and Dr. King talks about when we have successes, not only he, but as people, that's a mountaintop experience, but there's also valley experiences. So talk about when he came out against the Vietnam War and how that was not a mountaintop experience when he made that speech. It didn't get the support and the hurrahs that the I Have a Dream speech did.
It was Riverside Church in New York, April 4th, 1967. And King starts it out. There comes a time when silence is betrayal. There's no great sadness without great love. And then he talks about how deadly and dangerous the war in Vietnam is, how many innocents are dying from it, and that American integrity, American respect is being lost quickly, and that we're on the side of colonizers, not liberating people. And he lost about half of his following, both black and white, after he made the speech. It was another cross to bear, and he made it with great courage. You know, and we're looking at at a war today where most people are afraid to speak out against what's going on to the Palestinians. Because that's right. Because defense isn't genocide, as South Africa is now claiming, in the UN. So, but it's very difficult to come out against a sitting president in an election year, where it will cause you to have enemies because you've spoken out against U.S. foreign policy. King did it. He lost power and respect, but he felt he had to do it because he felt it was critical to speak truth to power with love. And we see him as having premature morality. I mean, a couple of years later, the country was exactly at that position. Only we're trying to figure out how to end a war. Because it's always easier to start the war than it is to end the war. We're going to see that in Gaza, just as we saw it in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah, and what happened was that President Lyndon Johnson, who actually, we held President Kennedy because, he sent troops and the things he did, but the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1964 and 65 were actually passed under President Lyndon Johnson's administration. And so, in that way, that gave Dr. King and others a huge victory. And President Johnson felt like, okay, I did this for you, and then you came out against my war, the war that I'm over. I'm the commander in chief, the Vietnam War, and Lyndon Johnson felt betrayed. And I believe a lot of King's supporters, I don't think it's so much that they thought he had betrayed, that they were afraid that he came out against the president of the United States. And they expected that he would lose support financially and that he was done.
Yeah, I think there were strategic, tactical, and ethical questions that surrounded it because it was new territory for a religious and political leader to come out against the president as the war was expanding. And King could see it more clearly. His briefings were good, and it did lead to animosity against him from the government. And you're right, almost all historians see Johnson claiming that he was betrayed by King on the issue. When ultimately, by early 68 in the Tet Offensive, Johnson realizes it's the wrong war. It can't be won. It's ruining his legacy. And he might not get reelected. And that's when he resigned. He basically says he won't run again.
I won't run again. And even Justice Thurgood Marshall, the first Black Supreme Court justice, wrote an article condemning King for making that speech. Even members of his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was debating whether or not they should ask him to step down and lose his position. So it wasn't just the president, it just wasn't whites and some people, it was some of the key supporters that he had, right?
Ultimately, he believed you must speak truth to power with love. And that's going to be a path to liberate people.
Right.
And he took, he didn't know what was going to happen next, and he took the risk. And, in retrospect, we realize the greatness and the courage to do it, but it was risky at the time.
And then there's the riots. Then the riots break out. Now there's a Black Power movement. Now we've had some of the leaders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee are now saying nonviolence is not the way. And so King starts to get people in the Black community who are questioning his tactics, his strategy, his philosophy, his theology, and there's riots all over the place, right?
That's true. Revolution of rising expectations. And
I like the way you say that, revolution of rising expectations.
And folks were angry. The injustice was clear. we're still fighting for economic justice today. Minimum wage is as low as it was back then, but few people are damning it as being a crime in this wealthy nation for people to work for starvation wages. That I think that language was necessary. It kept the legitimacy of King, whose following was eroding because some people thought he was too moderate. Of course, violence breeds more violence, contempt, misunderstanding. So King stayed true to his principles, but there were others that were far more impatient. And we have to face it. We still have half of America living paycheck to paycheck, and 20% of the kids living in poverty. So
yeah, 20% of children in this country.
And it comes back to what you said. We are confronting the poisons of partisanship as well as money in politics and corporate America controlling the mass media. So we aren't seeing these problems on a regular basis. They're out of sight, out of mind.
And politicians and other leaders are not even bothered to address them because they're not. You know, my thing is that we elect leaders because they're supposed to be changing the system, not maintaining and defending the system, which is a hard thing because you have to operate in the system. And I think I know that's why some issues that have lasted from Dr. King's time to today don't get addressed because they know, some of our leaders know how controversial it is to even talk about those things. And so Dr. King enters this period of depression. You know, on the Canadian broadcasting system, he was interviewed and he says that he's asked, Dr. King, how's your dream going? He said, I'm afraid it might be turning into a nightmare, you know. And again, that's for those who are out there who are involved, want to be involved, that sometimes you can do your very best and get to those mountaintop heights and then, wow, things turn bad and it looks like, man, my dream is a nightmare. But he went on, he continued on, right? And let's talk about his, because that is just starting to come out, Michael Eric Dyson's book, Year in the Life of a King, and there's some piece. He really enters a period of deep depression, doesn't he?
He does, and my sense is he realizes the way out of it is what has guided him into this journey in the first place. To keep his faith without works is dead, just keep fighting, you're going to figure it out. And a lot of times they were guessing because it's new territory. But, you know, in retrospect, the abolitionist movement many times was just guessing. The women's movement, yes.
Every movement, you're
labor movement, right? Gay rights movement, environmental movement. What do we do next? You're in the midst of the environmental justice movement, and people are wondering, how do we confront the madness of climate change?
Yes.
You're in the middle of the debates, and people are wondering, what do we do next to capture the imagination of the public? Because even on Earth Day, there aren't good enough stories on climate change.
Right. And we know that's it. And, you know, I try not to talk about it too much because some people know that's one of the main issues I'm working on. But we just had a week where 49 states had suffered some type of severe weather. We just had a Christmas where it was it was in the 50s in South Carolina. It was in the 50s in Washington, D.C., and it was 55 degrees in Chicago, Illinois on the same day. So I don't want to digress, but sometimes things are they appear to be so obvious, but you're guessing, you're trying to figure out, how do we wake people up? How do we get them engaged? And Dr. King, and that can sometimes make people depressed and downhearted. But one of the things I like is that Dr. King didn't give up. He kept on speaking, he kept on working, and he really struggled. I remember seeing and maybe you remember this, what documentary this was. His great friend, Harry Belafonte. They were great friends, and they actually showed a piece of Dr. King speaking, and he had this nervous tick where he's speaking and his head jerks to the side, and Harry Belafonte noticed that it went away. This is when he's deeply depressed, and Harry Belafonte says to Dr. King, he said, "What happened to your nervous tick, doctor? Why did it go away?" And Dr. King said, "I've made my peace with death." At this point in his life, he realizes, and this is a man who's had death threats. He was, hit in the head with bricks. He was beaten. He was stabbed in Harlem, New York,
right,
by a demented woman. And the doctor said that if he had sneezed or coughed, the wound was so close to his heart, he would have died. So someone who goes through all of that and then finally says, "I've made my peace with death," he knows after he starts to lose support, he knows that his life is really, really on knife's edge.
Absolutely. And we've talked about this just to add a bit more to the story. The FBI had been following everything he'd been doing for the last 10 years.
Yes.
They had wiretapped his rooms. They followed his personal life. They made tapes of his personal life to try to smear him.
Yes.
I mean, the pressure was coming there, and death threats from the FBI.
Yeah. He even tried to get Coretta Scott King to divorce him,
right,
because of some of the things they have recorded. Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's called COINTELPRO, for those in our audience who don't know. It's the FBI's counterintelligence program, and the purpose was to make sure that no Black messiah arose to lead Black people, because they were afraid of a revolution and felt that the movement for freedom that was going on in America was the greatest threat to the country at this time. And I'm not making that up, right?
No, absolutely. And a lot of that's been declassified. As we've talked about before, a lot of the files on King have still not been declassified.
Right.
As the files on the Kennedy assassination have not been fully declassified, as the files on the King assassination have not been fully declassified.
We don't know what really happened.
That's right. Do we have time to get into that a little bit?
Oh, yes, I think so. Yes, absolutely. Good. We can jump around some the public needs to know. Right.
Well, when I ask my students, the general cross section of college students, what King was doing in '68, they say, well, he was fighting for civil rights. And occasionally I'll get a student that'll say, wasn't he speaking out against the war? Very few know that he was working on Poor People's March on Washington. And just a few seem to remember that he was working in Memphis with the sanitation workers so they could have representation, because they were working at such low wages and in dangerous conditions, and the mayor wasn't meeting with them. And King at that time was on all of the CIA lists. Military intelligence was following him. And he was a threat to the powers that be, that could see that while he lost a lot of his following speaking out against the war in Vietnam, it was building again in '68.
And globally.
He was seen as a global citizen, speaking out, and he talks about it in his Revolution of Values, where he says, in the final analysis, our loyalties must become global if we're to save the best in our own tribe, race, class, and nation. So he was a great threat to the powers that be. They talked about him maybe running for president.
Yes.
And regarding his assassination, if you go to the museum in Memphis, the education leader there will talk you through the research on the assassination, where you have 5 witnesses saying the shots came from a different place. They're pretty clear about it. The only
all of the Black police officers and firemen at that time, they all were transferred out of that district that day.
That's right.
Yeah.
And they've spoken and are on the record and have been for years to that effect, where you see people pointing on the balcony to where the shot came from is actually a swath of land that had bushes and trees on it that were cut the next day on the order of Frank Holloman, who was the head of the police and fire department, who was the number 3 man at the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover for years.
Yes.
So we have the leading witness to the assassination of King being a fellow that was so drunk, his favorite cab driver wouldn't drive him to a bar.
James Earl
James Earl Ray was.
I mean, James Earl Ray, right?
Right.
I'm talking about the actor.
And the witness, Charles Stevens' common law wife, who was with him in the room, said Charles was so drunk he couldn't see anything. That's the government witness. I was challenged one time by a lawyer in Los Angeles who knew the case. He said the only way to believe what the government is saying is to not read it. And he was right. There's a lot of questions that remain to be answered on this when the fire department right across from Lorraine Motel,
which is where he was staying and where he was shot and assassinated.
Right.
On the balcony.
On the day of the assassination, 2 people identifying themselves to the captain of the fire department as military intelligence walked up to the roof and had a briefcase with them. Well, they quickly left after the assassination, but that's the testimony from the civil trial in 1999 by Fire Department Captain Carthel Whedon. I mean, but this is never mentioned on Martin Luther King Day, and clearly has to be part of the record. And I think it speaks, as you and I have often said, to the power of nonviolence, that he was such a threat to the powers that be that they didn't want him alive.
They didn't want him alive anymore. And you know, I kind of look at too that, you know, from the beginning, the very beginning of his you know, his being involved in this great movement to the time when he makes his speech during the March on Washington, which starts off talking about economic justice.
Yep.
And that Black people are owed a check from the federal government, you know, and up until the time that he's assassinated, he has kind of swung back to that because he's planning a poor people's campaign. And you can talk about what the poor people's campaign, if you don't mind, consists of, what that plan, that strategy was, and what the direct action was going to look like. But he has swung back to that point, which is why he had come to Memphis to support the sanitation workers who were working under deplorable conditions and getting paid nowhere near what they should have been getting paid at that time. So he had kind of made, in my mind, he didn't stop doing anything he was doing, but he understood the importance of economic injustice and the need for every human being to have what he called a guaranteed income.
He called for that, absolutely.
He called for guaranteed income. Everybody should be guaranteed by the government a certain amount of money so you didn't have to struggle, go hungry, lose a roof, you know, not have a decent place to stay. So it's kind of like he had come around full circle to his main point, because with economics, that deals with racism, it deals with militarism, all of those things. But if you don't mind, talk a little bit about what he wanted to do with the Poor People's Campaign before we get to Mason's Temple and the last speech that most people know that gets quoted on his birthday. I've been to the mountaintop, his mountaintop speech.
Yeah, you're right. Economic justice, King said, was critical if we're to have social justice. And he wanted a multi-ethnic coalition of people, poor and non-poor, to go to Washington to demand their rights, and for people in Washington, the elected leaders, to meet and hear the stories of people who were poor because they literally couldn't imagine them very well. And part of this was inspired by a South Carolina woman named Marion Wright Edelman.
Oh, yeah.
Young attorney who took King as well as Robert Kennedy in different trips through poor areas in Mississippi and South Carolina so that they could become better acquainted with these problems and then become activists to fight for justice.
Yeah. And South Carolina is still one of the poorest states in this country. That's one of the reasons why she took them into South Carolina, right?
Absolutely. And she's still fighting. The Children's Defense Fund has been around for years, and it's a great website to look at and a great struggle to join. And if I might go off on just a tangent,
I was going to say, didn't you have some interaction with her?
Well, I've talked with her people, and we're planning to have a day of prayer and song at the steps of the State House in Columbia sometime in the fall on behalf of children's rights. Because Marion Wright Edelman, I think, was correct in inspiring Martin Luther King. I think that message is something that we need to pick up today. And we're calling for all children to have a right to food, healthcare, housing, good schools, safe streets, clean air, and clean water. We want the religious and non-religious community to join us for a day of prayer and song at the steps of the State House so that we can start to, as King said, build a wider coalition for economic justice.
And that is so necessary today because teen suicide rate skyrocketing, violence between young people. Talk about that a little more.
Well, what I saw in the state prisons in California in the early 80s is true today when you talk to young people who grow up in rough surroundings in poor neighborhoods with broken families, crime, drugs around them, parents who have fallen into despair. And you ask the question to kids, at what point did you lose hope? They'll typically say 10, 11, and 12. You know, and they made some bad choices, but they didn't pick their parents, they didn't pick their schools, their community, or their country, and they have not been heard. They need to be heard. Those problems are there. The trauma of lack of access to food, problems with health care. If kids are unable to learn well in school by fourth grade, then they fall further and further behind, and they're likely to drop out of school and have that sense of despair. We don't have enough counselors in the schools. When I started teaching in the public schools, 6 classes, 40 in a class. I knew it was impossible because every teacher in the teacher's lounge was burned out. I was the novelty. I was trying new things. It isn't too much different today. And I think part of the leadership in city government should be to go into the low-income schools and help tutor kids who are falling behind in reading. And they can hear the stories from kids themselves and understand how kids have to be given more opportunities. And that if we're really committed to freedom, that we're committed to equal opportunity in this country.
Yes, and so that'll be on the fall, and please let us know the date so we can let our audience know. So then King comes to support the sanitation workers in Memphis. And I believe that he knows because, remember, we talked about, he didn't start the march in Selma across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. He came in after Bloody Sunday. When he talked about going to the mountaintop, he was talking about all of us going to the mountaintop, and how sometimes we were at the top of the mountain with Birmingham, with Montgomery, with I Have a Dream, and then other times we were in Valley. So I believe that, and this is just my opinion, that when, because we're almost out of time, when he goes to Mason's Temple, which he wasn't going to speak because the weather was bad. They were predicting a really terrible storm.
And he had a cold.
And he had a cold, but the people came out, the church is packed, and they go back to the hotel and say, Dr. King, you got to come. They're waiting for it. And he gives his last speech. And he all of this is going on, military intelligence, CIA, FBI, threats. The president has turned against him. But I believe that his work with the sanitation employees and his plans for the Poor People's Campaign, he believed that we were going to another mountaintop experience. And he also knew because of the threats, he said, I might not get there with you. So we're out of time. We got to have you back so we can talk about some other elements and some other great leaders who gave us guidance for the work we should be doing right now, but we forgot. We just took portions of their speeches, portion of their dreams, just a quote here and there. And I believe, again, my belief, that while we're still going through some of the things that we were going through in their time is because we didn't continue to work and we have forgotten in large part the dream. So
I agree with you.
Yeah.
It's great to join you. And I think it's the challenge of our generation to continue the work on that with economic justice. And I look forward to talking more about it with you.
Oh, yeah. Well, tell people how they can reach you and tell them what district you're in so they can follow your campaign, which you've already announced you're running for Congress again, right?
True story, malhyman.com, malhyman.com. Be at a number of events for Martin Luther King Day. Looking forward to speaking wherever. Would like to help, call me in. I'd like to meet people personally for discussions, to speak in churches. It's a grassroots organization. I won't take a dime of corporate or banking money because no one can serve two masters. Want to show that if you do the community organizing, we try to lead at the state level, that somebody actually could get to Congress on less than $500,000. And maybe we can be a model for others, and we'll build a coalition for a progressive agenda, which is at least as important as any electoral campaign. So I look forward to any of you that would like to join in building that day of prayer and song at the steps of the State House on behalf of children, and look forward to joining you again.
Dr. Mal Hyman, thank you so much. I know people have learned a lot about the great leader that we lost. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can do that by going to info@newalphacdc.com. Visit our website, www.newalphacdc.com, or you can call me at the church that I'm still blessed to pastor, Kingdom Living Temple, 705 South Irby Street, Florence, South Carolina. And the phone number is 843-799-0740. Thank you once again, Dr. Hyman. And remember, if you want to know the things you need to know and the places you need to go, tune in next week for the Leo and Larry show. God bless you.